In the high-stakes theater of modern asymmetrical warfare, security is often viewed as a mathematical equation. At Bagram Airfield in 2009, that equation involved billions of dollars in thermal imaging, biometric scanners, miles of high-tensile concertina wire, and a cadre of guards trained to treat every anomaly as a lethal threat. Yet the most destabilizing event to hit the desk of Colonel David Hutchinson didn't involve an explosion or a breach by the Taliban. It involved a paradox. 4 Australian soldiers had been formally denied entry at the main gate due to a lack of paperwork. 40 minutes later, they were found deep within the base's most restricted interior, moving with the casual confidence of men who had walked through walls. This wasn't a failure of technology. It was a failure of philosophy. The incident report that reached Hutchinson's desk triggered a crisis of confidence within the American security apparatus. Bagram wasn't just a base, it was a sprawling, high-density logistical hive, the nerve center for all coalition operations in Afghanistan. Every square inch of its perimeter was designed to be observed, logged, and controlled. But the 4 operators from the Australian Special Air Service Regiment, SASR, had navigated this controlled system as if it were a natural landscape. When challenged inside the secure zone, they didn't offer a dramatic tale of infiltration. They simply stated they had, quote, 1 and had, quote, 2. To a career officer like Hutchinson, the phrase, quote, 3 was an operational nightmare. It suggested that the layered defenses, the motion sensors, the surveillance towers, the procedural safeguards refined over years of combat, were essentially transparent to a specific type of human intent. This prompted an immediate, frantic review. Security teams scoured the surveillance footage, looking for the telltale signs of a cut fence or a compromised gate. They found nothing. No alarms had been triggered. No biometric logs had been bypassed because no biometric logs were even engaged. The Australians hadn't broken the system. They had simply ignored it. As Hutchinson's team expanded their inquiry, they discovered that Bagram was merely the latest chapter in a long-running, unpublicized saga of friction between American process and Australian autonomy. The archives revealed a trail of similar ghost sightings stretching back to the earliest days of the war. In 2002, at Kandahar Airfield, the American Logistics Corps was left baffled when they opened a double-locked, high-security munitions compound, a facility that required 3 separate layers of clearance to find 2 Australian SASR operators inside. They weren't planting explosives. They were holding rifles, calmly discussing the barrel harmonics of a weapon system they were curious about. When asked how they had gained entry to a facility that was, on paper, inaccessible, they provided a terrifyingly practical explanation. We needed to be familiar with the gear our partners are using. Better to learn here than in a firefight. The how of their entry was left unsaid, hidden behind a professional shrug. The cultural rift became even more pronounced 3 weeks later when American intelligence analysts entered a U.S.-only SCIF, Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility, to find Australian personnel reviewing operational summaries of insurgent movements. There were no signs of lockpicking, no digital hacking. The operators had simply identified a gap in the human routine, a shift change, a propped door, a moment of distraction, and stepped through it. To the American military mind, this was a breach of the most sacred tenet of theater operations: control. American base security is built on the assumption that everyone, regardless of rank or nationality, will follow the prescribed path. It is a system designed to manage tens of thousands of people at scale. It depends on the guard at the gate being the final arbiter of truth. If the guard says no, the world is supposed to stop. But the SASR is built on a diametrically opposed foundation: mission initiative. From the first day of their brutal selection process, Australian operators are trained to treat a no as a logistical hurdle to be cleared, not a command to be obeyed. They are optimized for small-team, long-range reconnaissance where there is no higher command to ask for permission. In the remote valleys of the Hindu Kush, an operator who waits for a signature is an operator who misses the target or loses his team. Over decades of bush warfare and counterterrorism, they have developed a collective psyche that prioritizes the result over the protocol. This structural incompatibility reached a boiling point by the mid-2000s. As the Australian footprint in Afghanistan expanded, so did their tendency to test the architecture of their allies. It wasn't born out of malice or arrogance, but out of a relentless professional curiosity. If an SASR team was told a facility was ___4__, their natural instinct was to find out exactly how true that statement was. In several forward operating bases, FOBs, Australian operators began appearing in high-level targeting briefings where their names weren't on the manifest. When questioned, they would explain that their unit was operating in the same province and they thought it best to stay in the loop. They didn't forge ID cards. They simply walked in with such absolute, unwavering confidence that the guards assumed they were exactly where they were supposed to be. They exploited the, quote, 6. They knew that a guard is trained to look for a, quote, 7, someone nervous, someone hiding, someone aggressive. They presented as, quote, 8. They were just soldiers in uniform, moving with purpose. By 2007, this clash of philosophies moved from the office to the wire, leading to the infamous incident at Camp Bastion. Helmand Province was a furnace of insurgent activity, and Bastion was under constant threat of reconnaissance probes by the Taliban. One night, the American motion sensor array on the eastern perimeter lit up with a series of high-priority alerts. Observation posts reported multiple figures moving in a low-profile tactical formation toward the fence. The response was massive and immediate. This was exactly what the Americans had trained for. A quick reaction force, QRF, scrambled into their strikers. Apache gunships spun their rotors on the pads. Artillery units slewed their guns to preset coordinates. The base was seconds away from raining absolute destruction on a suspected Taliban sabotage team. When the QRF finally pinned the intruders down with searchlights and thermal optics just yards from the wire, they didn't find insurgents. They found 4 Australians in bush hats. The Australians were remarkably unfazed by the fact that they were staring down the barrels of 40 M4 carbines. They explained that they were conducting a live security audit. They wanted to see if the American sensor suite could detect a low thermal signature team approaching from the sun-baked rocks. They wanted to know if the response time was fast enough to catch them before they hit the wire. To the Australians, this was a practical gift, a free lesson in defensive vulnerability. If there was a blind spot in the radar, better to have a mate find it than a suicide bomber. But to the American command, this was a dangerous breach of deconfliction. A defensive alert triggered under false pretenses wasn't just a waste of fuel and resources. It was a recipe for, to a combat zone, the line between an ___quote __3 ___ and an __quote _4 ___ is a hair trigger. This was the moment the irritation turned into a formal policy change. The U.S. Central Command realized that you cannot have a force that __quote _5 __, living inside a system that __quote _6 __. The two models were technically allies, but operationally mismatched. The Americans viewed the Australians as undisciplined mavericks who jeopardized the safety of the base. The Australians viewed the Americans as rigid bureaucrats who were so focused on the locks that they forgot to watch the windows. The review of the Bastion incident led to the imposition of much stricter access requirements. Advanced notification became a digital mandate. Escort requirements were reinforced with the threat of disciplinary action. But even as the paperwork grew heavier, the SASR operators continued to move like ghosts through the machine. They simply adjusted their timing. They learned the new schedules, the new biometric cycles, and they continued to solve the problem of the __7__. The lesson of these years wasn't about which military was better. It was about the limits of architecture. You can build a wall a mile high, but if the man guarding it expects everyone to be a friend, the wall doesn't exist. The SASR proved that in any alliance, the greatest friction isn't with the enemy, it's with the partner who thinks differently. By the late 2000s, the Australian problem had transitioned from a series of quirky anecdotes into a genuine structural concern for U.S. Central Command. It became clear that the security architecture of megabases like Bagram and Kandahar was being bypassed, not through high-tech gadgetry, but through a masterclass in social engineering and behavioral exploitation. The SASR had identified the ultimate vulnerability in the American military machine, its rigid reliance on the Standard Operating Procedure, SOP. The internal investigations conducted after the Bagram incident revealed a fascinating methodology. The Australian operators weren't sneaking through drainage pipes or rappelling from rafters. They were using confidence as camouflage. In one specific case study, it was noted that an SASR team gained access to a restricted flight line simply by carrying a heavy crate and looking busy and annoyed. They understood a fundamental law of human psychology. People rarely challenge someone who looks like they are performing a difficult task they've done 1,000 times before. While the American security apparatus was looking for infiltrators, men in masks or local nationals with suspicious bags, the Australians were hiding in plain sight as professionals. They utilized the human firewall gap. They knew exactly when the shift changes occurred at the ECPs, entry control points. They knew that during the first 15 minutes of a new shift, guards are often more focused on settling in than on scrutinizing every familiar-looking uniform. The strategic friction. This behavioral divergence created a deep-seated tension. For the American commanders, the base was a controlled system. Its safety was a product of every gear in the machine turning in the same direction. When an Australian operator bypassed a checkpoint, he wasn't just, quote, zero. He was throwing a wrench into the gears. The American concern was rooted in the concept of, quote, one. If a friend can walk in unnoticed, the logic follows that a sophisticated enemy, an insurgent who has studied the base for months, could eventually replicate that behavior. The Australians conversely viewed the base as a supporting environment, not a prison. Their training emphasized that the mission exists, quote, two, in the valleys and the villages. The base was merely a place to get fuel, ammo, and intel. If the administrative, quote, three, hindered the speed of the mission, the SASR culture dictated that the red tape should be cut. To them, the Americans were suffering from __quote_4__, becoming so obsessed with the locks on the doors that they were losing their peripheral vision. The 2007 incident at Camp Bastion was the final straw. It forced a realization that the risk of __quote_5__, friendly fire, was no longer theoretical. When the Americans scrambled attack helicopters to intercept what turned out to be Australian, quote, six, the command realized they were one nervous trigger finger away from a diplomatic and military catastrophe. In the aftermath, the Pentagon and the Australian Department of Defense reached a quiet but firm understanding. The solution was operational separation, liaison-only access. Routine physical access for SASR personnel to U.S.-only facilities was restricted. Instead of, quote, seven, quote, communication was channeled through formal liaison officers, LNOs. Digital preclearance. The __quote_8___ culture was dismantled by integrating Australian personnel into the American Digital Access Rosters, JPAS, weeks before they arrived at a base. If your name wasn't in the flickering green light of the computer screen, the gate stayed shut. Physical relocation. Increasingly, SASR elements were encouraged to operate out of British-controlled sectors or their own specialized compounds within compounds. By creating a physical buffer, the two different operating systems could function side by side without crashing the motherboard. The story of the Bagram and Bastion breaches remains a cornerstone lesson in modern coalition warfare. It proved that interoperability is not just about having the same radio frequencies or the same caliber of ammunition. It is about philosophical alignment. American security doctrine is optimized for scale and protection. It is a defensive wall that protects tens of thousands by enforcing a common denominator of behavior. Australian SASR doctrine is optimized for autonomy and speed. It is an offensive spear that relies on individual judgment to navigate obstacles. When these two ideologies met at a locked gate, the gate was always going to fail. Not because the gate was weak, but because the two forces were speaking different languages of security. One saw a rule as a safeguard, the other saw it as a test. By 2010, the incidents had largely subsided, not because the Australians had stopped being inventive, but because the distance between the two cultures had been codified into law. The Ghost family continued to operate in the shadows of the Afghan mountains, but they were no longer haunting the halls of the American headquarters. The Americans had learned to watch their human firewall more closely, and the Australians had learned that even among friends, a little bit of paperwork is sometimes the only thing that keeps the guns from firing in the wrong direction. The contradiction of the four men at the gate, denied at 800, found inside at 840, was never about a breach in the wire. It was a breach in the expectation of obedience. It remains a testament to the fact that in any conflict, the most unpredictable element is not the technology, but the human spirit trained to believe that no wall is truly impassable.